They assign the same importance to the same sets of circumstances and cut reality into the same categories. Once again, the manifestation of Platonicity, the desire to cut reality into crisp shapes. What Robert Fisk calls hotel journalism further increased the mental contagion. While Lebanon in earlier journalism was part of the Levant, i.e., the Eastern Mediterranean, it now suddenly became part of the Middle East, as if someone had managed to transport it closer to the sands of Saudi Arabia. The island of Cyprus, around 60 miles from my village in northern Lebanon, and with almost identical food, churches, and habits, suddenly became part of Europe. Of course, the natives on both sides became subsequently conditioned. While in the past a distinction had been drawn between Mediterranean and non-Mediterranean, i.e., between the olive oil and the butter, in the 1970s the distinction suddenly became that between Europe and non-Europe, Islam being the wedge between the two. One does not know where to place the indigenous Arabic-speaking Christians, or Jews, in that story. Categorizing is necessary for humans. But it becomes pathological when the category is seen as definitive, preventing people from considering the fuzziness of boundaries, let alone revising their categories. Contagion was the culprit. If you selected 100 independent-minded journalists capable of seeing factors in isolation from one another, you would get 100 different opinions. But the process of having these people report in lockstep caused the dimensionality of the opinion set to shrink considerably. They converged on opinions and used the same items as causes. For instance, to depart from Lebanon for a moment, all reporters now refer to the Roaring '80s, assuming that there was something particularly distinct about that exact decade. And during the internet bubble of the late 1990s, journalists agreed on crazy indicators as explanatory of the quality of worthless companies that everyone wanted very badly. Asterisk. If you want to see what I mean by the arbitrariness of categories, check the situation of polarized politics. The next time a Martian visits Earth, try to explain to him why those who favor allowing the elimination of a fetus in the mother's womb also oppose capital punishment. Or try to explain to him why those who accept abortion are supposed to be favorable to high taxation but against a strong military. Why do those who prefer sexual freedom need to be against individual economic liberty? I noticed the absurdity of clustering when I was quite young. By some farcical turn of events, in that civil war of Lebanon, Christians became pro-free market and the capitalistic system, i.e., what a journalist would call the right, and the Islamists became socialists. Getting support from communist regimes, Pravda, the organ of the communist regime, called them oppression fighters, though subsequently when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, it was the Americans who sought association with bin Laden and his Muslim peers. The best way to prove the arbitrary character of these categories, and the contagion effect they produce, is to remember how frequently these clusters reverse in history. Today's alliance between Christian fundamentalists and the Israeli lobby would certainly seem puzzling to a 19th century intellectual. Christians used to be anti-Semites and Muslims were the protectors of the Jews, whom they preferred to Christians. Libertarians used to be left-wing. What is interesting to me as a probabilist is that some random event makes one group that initially supports an issue ally itself with another group that supports another issue, thus causing the two items to fuse and unify, until the surprise of the separation. Categorizing always produces reduction in true complexity. It is a manifestation of the Black Swan generator, that unshakable Platonicity that I defined in the prologue. Any reduction of the world around us can have explosive consequences since it rules out some sources of uncertainty. It drives us to a misunderstanding of the fabric of the world. For instance, You may think that radical Islam and its values are your allies against the threat of communism. And so you may help them develop until they send 2 planes into downtown Manhattan. It was a few years after the beginning of the Lebanese War, as I was attending the Wharton School, at the age of 22, that I was hit with the idea of efficient markets, an idea that holds that there is no way to derive profits from traded securities since these instruments have automatically incorporated all the available information. Public information can therefore be useless, particularly to a businessman, since prices can already include all such information, and news shared with millions gives you no real advantage. Odds are that one or more of the hundreds of millions of other readers of such information will already have bought the security, thus pushing up the price. I then completely gave up reading newspapers and watching television, which freed up a considerable amount of time, say 1 hour or more a day. Enough time to read more than 100 additional books per year, which, after a couple of decades, starts mounting. But this argument was not quite the entire reason for my dictum in this book to avoid the newspapers, as we will see further benefits in avoiding the toxicity of information. It was initially a great excuse to avoid keeping up with the minutiae of business, a perfect alibi since I found nothing interesting about the details of the business world, inelegant, dull, pompous, greedy, unintellectual, selfish, and boring. Where is the show? Why someone with plans to become a philosopher, or a scientific philosopher of history, would wind up in business school. And the Wharton School no less, still escapes me. There I saw that it was not merely some inconsequential politician in a small and antique country, and his philosophical driver Mikhail, who did not know what was going on. After all, people in small countries are supposed to not know what is going on. What I saw was that in one of the most prestigious business schools in the world, in the most potent country in the history of the world, the executives of the most powerful corporations were coming to describe what they did for a living. And it was possible that they too did not know what was going on. As a matter of fact, in my mind it was far more than a possibility. I felt in my spine the weight of the epistemic arrogance of the human race. I became obsessive. At the time, I started becoming conscious of my subject, the highly improbable consequential event. And it was not only well-dressed, testosterone-charged corporate executives who were usually fooled by this concentrated luck, but persons of great learning. This awareness turned my black swan from a problem of lucky or unlucky people in business into a problem of knowledge and science. My idea is that not only are some scientific results useless in real life, because they underestimate the impact of the highly improbable, or lead us to ignore it, but that many of them may be actually creating black swans. These are not just taxonomic errors that can make you flunk a class in ornithology. I started to see the consequences of the idea. 8 3/4 lbs later, 4.5 years after my graduation from Wharton, and 8 3/4 pounds heavier, on October 19, 1987. I walked home from the offices of the investment bank Credit Suisse First Boston in Midtown Manhattan to the Upper East Side. I walked slowly, as I was in a bewildered state. That day saw a traumatic financial event, the largest market drop in modern history. It was all the more traumatic in that it took place at a time when we thought we had become sufficiently sophisticated with all these intelligent talking platonified economists, with their phony bell curve-based equations, to prevent, or at least forecast and control, big shocks. The drop was not even the response to any discernible news. The occurrence of the event lay outside anything one could have imagined on the previous day. Had I pointed out its possibility, I would have been called a lunatic. It qualified as a black swan. But I did not know the expression then. I ran into a colleague of mine, Demetrius, on Park Avenue, and, as I started talking to him, an anxiety-ridden woman, losing all inhibitions, jumped into the conversation. "Hey, do the two of you know what's going on?" People on the sidewalk looked dazed. Earlier I had seen a few adults silently sobbing in the trading room of First Boston. I had spent the day at the epicenter of the events, with shell-shocked people running around like rabbits in front of headlights. When I got home, my cousin Alexis called to tell me that his neighbor committed suicide, jumping from his upper-floor apartment. It did not even feel eerie. It felt like Lebanon, with a twist, having seen both. I was struck that financial distress could be more demoralizing than war. Just consider that financial problems and the accompanying humiliations can lead to suicide. But war doesn't appear to do so directly. I feared a Pyrrhic victory. I had been vindicated intellectually, but I was afraid of being too right and seeing the system crumble under my feet. I did not really want to be that right. I will always remember the late Jimmy P. who, seeing his net worth in the process of melting down, kept half-jokingly begging the price on the screen to stop moving. But I realized then and there that I did not give a hoot about the money. I experienced the strangest feeling I have ever had in my life, this deafening trumpet signaling to me that I was right, so loudly that it made my bones vibrate. I have never had it since and will never be able to explain it to those who have never experienced it. It was a physical sensation, perhaps a mixture of joy, pride, and terror. And I felt vindicated? How? During the 1 or 2 years after my arrival at Wharton, I had developed a precise but strange specialty, betting on rare and unexpected events, those that were on the Platonic fold, and considered inconceivable by the Platonic experts. Recall that the Platonic fold is where our representation of reality ceases to apply, but we do not know it. For I was early to embrace, as a day job, the profession of quantitative finance. I became a quant and trader at the same time. A quant is a brand of industrial scientist who applies mathematical models of uncertainty to financial or socioeconomic data and complex financial instruments. Except that I was a quant exactly in reverse. I studied the flaws and the limits of these models, looking for the Platonic fold where they break down. Also, I engaged in speculative trading. Not just talk, which was rare for quants since they were prevented from taking risks, their role being confined to analysis, not decision-making. I was convinced that I was totally incompetent in predicting market prices, but that others were generally incompetent also but did not know it, or did not know that they were taking massive risks. Most traders were just picking pennies in front of a steamroller, exposing themselves to the high-impact rare event yet sleeping like babies, unaware of it. Mine was the only job you could do if you thought of yourself as risk-hating, risk-aware, and highly ignorant. Also, the technical baggage that comes with being a quant, a mixture of applied mathematics, engineering, and statistics, in addition to the immersion in practice, turned out to be very useful for someone wanting to be a philosopher. First, when you spend a couple of decades doing mass-scale empirical work with data and taking risks based on such studies, you can easily spot elements in the texture of the world that the Platonified thinker is too brainwashed or threatened to see. Second, it allowed me to become formal and systematic in my thinking instead of wallowing in the anecdotal. Finally, both the philosophy of history and epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge, seemed inseparable from the empirical study of time series data, which is a succession of numbers in time. A sort of historical document containing numbers instead of words. And numbers are easy to process on computers. Studying historical data makes you conscious that history runs forward, not backward. and that it is messier than narrated accounts. Epistemology, the philosophy of history, and statistics aim at understanding truths, investigating the mechanisms that generate them, and separating regularity from the coincidental in historical matters. They all address the question of what one knows, except that they are all to be found in different buildings, so to speak. The four-letter word of independence. That night, on October 19, 1987, I slept for 12 hours straight. It was hard to tell my friends, all hurt in some manner by the crash, about this feeling of vindication. Bonuses at the time were a fraction of what they are today, but if my employer, First Boston, and the financial system survived until year-end, I would get the equivalent of a fellowship. This is sometimes called F******U money, which, in spite of its coarseness, means that it allows you to act like a Victorian gentleman, free from slavery. It is a psychological buffer. The capital is not so large as to make you spoiled rich, but large enough to give you the freedom to choose a new occupation without excessive consideration of the financial rewards. It shields you from prostituting your mind and frees you from outside authority, any outside authority. Independence is person-specific. I have always been taken aback at the high number of people in whom an astonishingly high income led to additional sycophancy as they became more dependent on their clients and employers and more addicted to making even more money, while not substantial by some standards. It literally cured me of all financial ambition. It made me feel ashamed whenever I diverted time away from study for the pursuit of material wealth. Note that the designation F******U corresponds to the exhilarating ability to pronounce that compact phrase before hanging up the phone. These were the days when it was extremely common for traders to break phones when they lost money. Some resorted to destroying chairs, tables, or whatever would make noise. Once, in the Chicago pits, another trader tried to strangle me and it took 4 security guards to drag him away. He was irate because I was standing in what he deemed his territory. Who would want to leave such an environment? Compare it to lunches in a drab university cafeteria with gentle mannered professors discussing the latest departmental intrigue. So I stayed in the quant and trading businesses. I'm still there, but organized myself to do minimal but intense and entertaining work, focus only on the most technical aspects, never attend business meetings, avoid the company of achievers and people in suits who don't read books, and take a sabbatical year for every 3 on average to fill up gaps in my scientific and philosophical culture. To slowly distill my single idea, I wanted to become a flaneur, a professional meditator, sit in cafes, lounge, unglued to desks and organization structures, sleep as long as I needed, read voraciously, and not owe any explanation to anybody. I wanted to be left alone in order to build, small steps at a time, an entire system of thought based on my Black Swan idea. Limousine philosopher. The war in Lebanon and the crash of 1987 seemed identical phenomena. It became obvious to me that nearly everyone had a mental blind spot in acknowledging the role of such events. It was as if they were not able to see these mammoths, or that they rapidly forgot about them. The answer was looking straight at me. It was a psychological, perhaps even biological, blindness. The problem lay not in the nature of events, but in the way we perceived them. I end this autobiographical prelude with the following story. I had no defined specialty, outside of my day job, and wanted none. When people at cocktail parties asked me what I did for a living, I was tempted to answer, I am a skeptical empiricist and a flaneur reader. Someone committed to getting very deep into an idea, but I made things simple by saying that I was a limousine driver. Once, on a transatlantic flight, I found myself upgraded to first class next to an expensively dressed, high-powered lady dripping with gold and jewelry who continuously ate nuts, low-carb diet, perhaps. Insisted on drinking only Evian, all the while reading the European edition of the Wall Street Journal. She kept trying to start a conversation in broken French. Since she saw me reading a book, in French, by the sociologist-philosopher Pierre Bourdieu, which, ironically, dealt with the marks of social distinction. I informed her, in English, that I was a limousine driver, proudly insisting that I only drove very upper-end cars. An icy silence lasted the whole flight, and, although I could feel the tension, it allowed me to read in peace. Yevgenia's Black Swan, Pink Glasses and Success. How Yevgenia Stops Marrying Philosophers. I told you so 5 years ago. Yevgenia Nikolaevna Krasnova was an obscure and unpublished novelist, with an unusual background. She was a neuroscientist with an interest in philosophy. Her first 3 husbands had been philosophers. And she got it into her stubborn Franco-Russian head to express her research and ideas in literary form. She dressed up her theories as stories, and mixed them with all manner of autobiographical commentary. She avoided the journalistic prevarications of contemporary narrative nonfiction. On a clear April morning, John Smith left his house. Foreign dialogue was always written in the original language, with translations appended like movie subtitles. She refused to dub into bad English conversations that took place in bad Italian. No publisher would have given her the time of day, except that there was, at the time, some interest in those rare scientists who could manage to express themselves in semi-understandable sentences. A few publishers agreed to speak with her. They hoped that she would grow up and write a popular science book on consciousness. She received enough attention to get the courtesy of rejection letters and occasional insulting comments instead of the far more insulting and demeaning silence. Publishers were confused by her manuscript. She could not even answer their first question. Is this fiction or non-fiction? Nor could she respond to the, "Who is this book written for?" on the publisher's book proposal forms. She was told, "You need to understand who your audience is, and amateurs write for themselves. Professionals write for others." She was also told to conform to a precise genre because bookstores do not like to be confused and need to know where to place a book on the shelves. One editor protectively added, "This, my dear friend, will only sell 10 copies, including those bought by your ex-husbands and family members." She had attended a famous writing workshop 5 years earlier and came out nauseated. Writing well seemed to mean obeying arbitrary rules that had grown into gospel, with the confirmatory reinforcement of what we call experience. The writers she met were learning to retrofit what was deemed successful. They all tried to imitate stories that had appeared in past issues of The New Yorker, not realizing that most of what is new, by definition, cannot be modeled on past issues of The New Yorker. Even the idea of a short story was a Me Too concept to Yevgenia. The workshop instructor, gentle but firm in his delivery, told her that her case was utterly hopeless. Yevgenia ended up posting the entire manuscript of her main book, A Story of Recursion, on the web. There it found a small audience, which included the shrewd owner of a small unknown publishing house, who wore pink-rimmed glasses and spoke primitive Russian, convinced that he was fluent. He offered to publish her, and agreed to her condition to keep her text completely unedited. He offered her a fraction of the standard royalty rate in return for her editorial stricture. He had so little to lose. She accepted since she had no choice. It took 5 years for Yevgenia to graduate from the egomaniac without anything to justify it, stubborn and difficult to deal with category to persevering, resolute, painstaking, and fiercely independent. For her book slowly caught fire, becoming one of the great and strange successes in literary history, selling millions of copies and drawing so-called critical acclaim. The startup house has since become a big corporation, with a polite receptionist to greet visitors as they enter the main office. Her book has been translated into 40 languages, even French. You see her picture everywhere. She is said to be a pioneer of something called the conciliant school. Publishers now have a theory that truck drivers who read books do not read books written for truck drivers, and hold that readers despise writers who pander to them. A scientific paper, it is now understood, can hide trivialities or irrelevance with equations and jargon. Conciliant prose, by exposing an idea in raw form, allows it to be judged by the public. Today, Yevgenia has stopped marrying philosophers. They argue too much, and she hides from the press. In classrooms, literary scholars discuss the many clues indicating the inevitability of the new style. The distinction between fiction and non-fiction is considered too archaic to withstand the challenges of modern society. It was so evident that we needed to remedy the fragmentation between art and science. After the fact, her talent was so obvious. Many of the editors she later met blamed her for not coming to them, convinced that they would have immediately seen the merit in her work. In a few years, a literary scholar will write the essay From Kundera to Krasnova, showing how the seeds of her work can be found in Kundera, a precursor who mixed essay and metacommentary. Yevgenia never read Kundera, but did see the movie version of one of his books. There was no commentary in the movie. A prominent scholar will show how the influence of Gregory Bateson, who injected autobiographical scenes into his scholarly research papers, is visible on every page. Yevgenia has never heard of Bateson. Yevgenia's book is A Black Swan, the Speculator and the Prostitute, on the critical difference between speculators and prostitutes, fairness, unfairness, and Black Swans, Theory of Knowledge and Professional Incomes, how Extremistan is not the best place to visit, except, perhaps, if you are a winner. Yevgenia's rise from the second basement to superstar is possible in only one environment, which I call Extremistan. Asterisk. I will soon introduce the central distinction between the Black Swan generating province of Extremistan and the tame, quiet, and uneventful province of Mediocristan. The best, worst, advice. When I play back in my mind all the advice people have given me, I see that only a couple of ideas have stuck with me for life. The rest has been mere words. And I am glad that I did not heed most of it. Most consisted of recommendations such as be measured and reasonable in your statements, contradicting the Black Swan idea. Since empirical reality is not measured, and its own version of reasonableness does not correspond to the conventional middlebrow definition. To be genuinely empirical is to reflect reality as faithfully as possible. To be honorable implies not fearing the appearance and consequences of being outlandish. The next time someone pesters you with unneeded advice, gently remind him of the fate of the monk whom Ivan the Terrible put to death for delivering uninvited and moralizing advice. It works as a short-term cure. The most important piece of advice was, in retrospect, bad, but it was also, paradoxically, the most consequential, as it pushed me deeper into the dynamics of the Black Swan. It came when I was 22, one February afternoon, in the corridor of a building at 3400 Walnut Street in Philadelphia, where I lived. A second-year Wharton student told me to get a profession that is scalable, that is, one in which you are not paid by the hour and thus subject to the limitations of the amount of your labor. It was a very simple way to discriminate among professions and, from that, to generalize a separation between types of uncertainty, and it led me to the major philosophical problem. The problem of induction, which is the technical name for the black swan. It allowed me to turn the black swan from a logical impasse into an easy-to-implement solution and, as we will see in the next chapters, to ground it in the texture of empirical reality. How did career advice lead to such ideas about the nature of uncertainty? Some professions, such as dentists, consultants, or massage professionals, cannot be scaled. There is a cap on the number of patients or clients you can see in a given period of time. If you are a prostitute, you work by the hour and are, generally, paid by the hour. Furthermore, your presence is, I assume, necessary for the service you provide. If you open a fancy restaurant, you will at best steadily fill up the room, unless you franchise it. In these professions, no matter how highly paid, your income is subject to gravity. Your revenue depends on your continuous efforts more than on the quality of your decisions. Moreover, this kind of work is largely predictable. It will vary, but not to the point of making the income of a single day more significant than that of the rest of your life. In other words, it will not be black swan driven. Yevgenia Nikolaevna would not have been able to cross the chasm between underdog and supreme hero overnight had she been a tax accountant or a hernia specialist, but she would not have been an underdog either. Other professions allow you to add zeros to your output, and your income, if you do well, at little or no extra effort. Now being lazy, considering laziness as an asset, and eager to free up the maximum amount of time in my day to meditate and read, I immediately, but mistakenly, drew a conclusion. I separated the idea person, who sells an intellectual product in the form of a transaction or a piece of work, from the labor person, who sells you his work. If you are an idea person, you do not have to work hard. Only think intensely. You do the same work whether you produce 100 units or 1,000. In quant trading, the same amount of work is involved in buying 100 shares as in buying 100,000, or even 1,000,000. It is the same phone call, the same computation, the same legal document. The same expenditure of brain cells, the same effort in verifying that the transaction is right. Furthermore, you can work from your bathtub or from a bar in Rome. You can use leverage as a replacement for work. Well, okay, I was a little wrong about trading. One cannot work from a bathtub, but, when done right, the job allows considerable free time. The same property applies to recording artists or movie actors. You let the sound engineers and projectionists do the work. There is no need to show up at every performance in order to perform. Similarly, a writer expends the same effort to attract one single reader as she would to capture several 100 million. J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter books, does not have to write each book again every time someone wants to read it. But this is not so for a baker. He needs to bake every single piece of bread in order to satisfy each additional customer. So the distinction between writer and baker, speculator and doctor, fraudster and prostitute, is a helpful way to look at the world of activities. It separates those professions in which one can add zeros of income with no greater labor from those in which one needs to add labor and time, both of which are in limited supply, in other words, those subjected to gravity. Beware the scalable. But why was the advice from my fellow student bad? If the advice was helpful, and it was, in creating a classification for ranking uncertainty and knowledge, it was a mistake as far as choices of profession went. It might have paid off for me, but only because I was lucky and happened to be in the right place at the right time, as the saying goes. If I myself had to give advice, I would recommend someone pick a profession that is not scalable. A scalable profession is good only if you are successful. They are more competitive, produce monstrous inequalities, and are far more random, with huge disparities between efforts and rewards. A few can take a large share of the pie, leaving others out entirely at no fault of their own. One category of profession is driven by the mediocre, the average, and the middle of the road. In it, the mediocre is collectively consequential. The other has either giants or dwarves, more precisely, a very small number of giants and a huge number of dwarves. Let us see what is behind the formation of unexpected giants, the Black Swan formation. The advent of scalability. Consider the fate of Giacomo, an opera singer at the end of the 19th century, before sound recording was invented. Say he performs in a small and remote town in central Italy. He is shielded from those big egos at La Scala in Milan and other major opera houses. He feels safe as his vocal cords will always be in demand somewhere in the district. There is no way for him to export his singing. And there is no way for the big guns to export theirs and threaten his local franchise. It is not yet possible for him to store his work, so his presence is needed at every performance. Just as a barber is, still, needed today for every haircut. So the total pie is unevenly split, but only mildly so, much like your calorie consumption. It is cut in a few pieces and everyone has a share. The big guns have larger audiences and get more invitations than the small guy, but this is not too worrisome. Inequalities exist, but let us call them mild. There is no scalability yet, no way to double the largest in-person audience without having to sing twice. Now consider the effect of the first music recording. An invention that introduced a great deal of injustice. Our ability to reproduce and repeat performances allows me to listen on my laptop to hours of background music of the pianist Vladimir Horowitz, now extremely dead, performing Rachmaninoff's preludes. Instead of to the local Russian émigré musician, still living, who is now reduced to giving piano lessons to generally untalented children for close to minimum wage. Horowitz, though dead, is putting the poor man out of business. I would rather listen to Vladimir Horowitz or Arthur Rubinstein for $10.99 a CD than pay $9.99 for one by some unknown, but very talented, graduate of the Juilliard School or the Prague Conservatory. If you ask me why I select Horowitz, I will answer that it is because of the order, rhythm, or passion, when in fact there are probably a legion of people I have never heard about. And will never hear about, those who did not make it to the stage, but who might play just as well. Some people naively believe that the process of unfairness started with the gramophone. According to the logic that I just presented, I disagree. I am convinced that the process started much, much earlier, with our DNA, which stores information about ourselves and allows us to repeat our performance without our being there by spreading our genes down the generations. Evolution is scalable. The DNA that wins, whether by luck or survival advantage, will reproduce itself, like a best-selling book or a successful record, and become pervasive. Other DNA will vanish. Just consider the difference between us humans, excluding financial economists and businessmen, and other living beings on our planet. Furthermore, I believe that the big transition in social life came not with the gramophone, but when someone had the great but unjust idea to invent the alphabet, thus allowing us to store information and reproduce it. It accelerated further when another inventor had the even more dangerous and iniquitous notion of starting a printing press, thus promoting texts across boundaries and triggering what ultimately grew into a winner-take-all ecology. Now, what was so unjust about the spread of books? The alphabet allowed stories and ideas to be replicated with high fidelity and without limit, without any additional expenditure of energy on the author's part for the subsequent performances. He didn't even have to be alive for them. Death is often a good career move for an author. This implies that those who, for some reason, start getting some attention can quickly reach more minds than others and displace the competitors from the bookshelves. In the days of bards and troubadours, everyone had an audience. A storyteller, like a baker or a coppersmith, had a market, and the assurance that none from far away could dislodge him from his territory. Today, a few take almost everything, the rest, next to nothing. By the same mechanism, the advent of the cinema displaced neighborhood actors, putting the small guys out of business. But there is a difference. In pursuits that have a technical component, like being a pianist or a brain surgeon, talent is easy to ascertain, with subjective opinion playing a relatively small part. The inequity comes when someone perceived as being marginally better gets the whole pie. In the arts, say the cinema, things are far more vicious. What we call talent generally comes from success, rather than its opposite. A great deal of empiricism has been done on the subject, most notably by Art Devaney, an insightful and original thinker who single-mindedly studied wild uncertainty in the movies. He showed that, sadly, much of what we ascribe to skills is an after-the-fact attribution. The movie makes the actor, he claims, and a large dose of nonlinear luck makes the movie. The success of movies depends severely on contagions. Such contagions do not just apply to the movies. They seem to affect a wide range of cultural products. It is hard for us to accept that people do not fall in love with works of art only for their own sake, but also in order to feel that they belong to a community. By imitating, we get closer to others, that is, other imitators. It fights solitude. This discussion shows the difficulty in predicting outcomes in an environment of concentrated success. So for now, let us note that the division between professions can be used to understand the division between types of random variables. Let us go further into the issue of knowledge, of inference about the unknown and the properties of the known. Scalability and globalization. Whenever you hear a snotty and frustrated European middlebrow presenting his stereotypes about Americans, he will often describe them as uncultured, unintellectual, and poor in math because, unlike his peers, Americans are not into equation drills and the constructions middlebrows call high culture, like knowledge of Goethe's inspirational and central trip to Italy, or familiarity with the Delft School of Painting. Yet the person making these statements is likely to be addicted to his iPod, wear blue jeans, and use Microsoft Word to jot down his cultural statements on his PC, with some Google searches here and there interrupting his composition. Well, it so happens that America is currently far more creative than these nations of museum goers and equation solvers. It is also far more tolerant of bottom-up tinkering and undirected trial and error. And globalization has allowed the United States to specialize in the creative aspect of things, the production of concepts and ideas, that is, the scalable part of the products, and, increasingly, by exporting jobs, separate the less scalable components and assign them to those happy to be paid by the hour. There is more money in designing a shoe than in actually making it. Nike, Dell, and Boeing can get paid for just thinking, organizing, and leveraging their know-how and ideas, while subcontracted factories in developing countries do the grunt work and engineers in cultured and mathematical states do the non-creative technical grind. The American economy has leveraged itself heavily on the idea generation, which explains why losing manufacturing jobs can be coupled with a rising standard of living. Clearly, the drawback of a world economy where the payoff goes to ideas is higher inequality among the idea generators, together with a greater role for both opportunity and luck, but I will leave the socio-economic discussion for part 3 and focus here on knowledge. travels inside mediocristan. This scalable, non-scalable distinction allows us to make a clear-cut differentiation between two varieties of uncertainties, two types of randomness. Let's play the following thought experiment. Assume that you round up 1,000 people randomly selected from the general population and have them stand next to one another in a stadium. You can even include Frenchmen, but please, not too many out of consideration for the others in the group: mafia members, non-mafia members, and vegetarians. Imagine the heaviest person you can think of and add him to that sample. Assuming he weighs 3 times the average, between 400 and 500 pounds. He will rarely represent more than a very small fraction of the weight of the entire population, in this case, about 0.5%. You can get even more aggressive. If you picked the heaviest biologically possible human on the planet, who yet can still be called a human, he would not represent more than, say, 0.6% of the total, a very negligible increase. And if you had 10,000 persons, his contribution would be vanishingly small. In the utopian province of Mediocristan, particular events don't contribute much individually, only collectively. I can state the supreme law of Mediocristan as follows. When your sample is large, no single instance will significantly change the aggregate or the total. The largest observation will remain impressive, but eventually insignificant, to the sum. I'll borrow another example from my friend Bruce Goldberg: your caloric consumption. Look at how much you consume per year. If you were classified as human, close to 800,000 calories. No single day, not even Thanksgiving at your great-aunt's, will represent a large share of that. Even if you tried to kill yourself by eating, that day's calories would not seriously affect your yearly consumption. Now, if I told you that it is possible to run into someone who weighs several thousand tons, or stands several hundred miles tall, you would be perfectly justified in having my frontal lobe examined. Or in suggesting that I switch to science fiction writing. But you cannot so easily rule out extreme variations with a different brand of quantities, to which we turn next. The strange country of Extremistan. Consider by comparison the net worth of the 1,000 people you lined up in the stadium. Add to them the wealthiest person to be found on the planet, say, Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft. Assume his net worth to be close to $80 billion, with the total capital of the others around a few million. How much of the total wealth would he represent? 99.9%? Indeed, all the others would represent no more than a rounding error for his net worth, the variation of his personal portfolio over the past second. For someone's weight to represent such a share, he would need to weigh 50 million pounds. Try it again with, say, book sales. Line up 1,000 authors, or people begging to get published, but calling themselves authors instead of waiters, and check their book sales. Then add the living writer who, currently, has the most readers. J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, with several 100 million books sold, will dwarf the remaining 1,000 authors with, say, collectively, a few 100,000 readers at most. Try it also with academic citations. The mention of one academic by another academic in a formal publication, media references, income, company size, and so on. Let us call these social matters, as they are man-made, as opposed to physical ones, like the size of waistlines. In Extremistan, inequalities are such that one single observation can disproportionately impact the aggregate, or the total. So while weight, height, and calorie consumption are from Mediocristan, wealth is not. Almost all social matters are from Extremistan. Another way to say it is that social quantities are informational, not physical. You cannot touch them. Money in a bank account is something important, but certainly not physical. As such, it can take any value without necessitating the expenditure of energy. It is just a number. Note that before the advent of modern technology, wars used to belong to mediocristan. It is hard to kill many people if you need to slaughter them one at the time. Today, with tools of mass destruction, all it takes is a button, a nutcase, or a small error to wipe out the planet. Look at the implication for the black swan. Extremistan can produce black swans, and does, since a few occurrences have had huge influences on history. This is the main idea of this book. Extremistan and knowledge. While this distinction, between mediocristan and extremistan, has severe ramifications for both social fairness and the dynamics of events, let us see its application to knowledge, which is where most of its value lies. If a Martian came to Earth and engaged in the business of measuring the heights of the denizens of this happy planet, he could safely stop at 100 humans to get a good picture of the average height. If you live in mediocristan, you can be comfortable with what you have measured, provided that you know for sure that it comes from mediocristan. You can also be comfortable with what you have learned from the data. The epistemological consequence is that with mediocristan-style randomness it is not possible to have a black swan surprise such that a single event can dominate a phenomenon. Primo. The first 100 days should reveal all you need to know about the data. Seconda. Even if you do have a surprise, as we saw in the case of the heaviest human, it would not be consequential. If you are dealing with quantities from extremistan, you will have trouble figuring out the average from any sample since it can depend so much on one single observation. The idea is not more difficult than that. In extremistan, one unit can easily affect the total in a disproportionate way. In this world, you should always be suspicious of the knowledge you derive from data. This is a very simple test of uncertainty that allows you to distinguish between the two kinds of randomness. Capiche? What you can know from data in mediocristan augments very rapidly with the supply of information. But knowledge in extremistan grows slowly and erratically with the addition of data. Some of it extreme, possibly at an unknown rate. Wild and mild. If we follow my distinction of scalable versus non-scalable, we can see clear differences shaping up between mediocristan and extremistan. Here are a few examples. Matters that seem to belong to mediocristan, subjected to what we call type 1 randomness, height, weight, calorie consumption, income for a baker, a small restaurant owner, a prostitute, or an orthodontist. Gambling profits, in the very special case, assuming the person goes to a casino and maintains a constant betting size, car accidents, mortality rates. IQ, as measured. Matters that seem to belong to extremistan, subjected to what we call type 2 randomness, wealth, income, book sales per author, book citations per author, name recognition as a celebrity. Number of references on Google, populations of cities, uses of words in a vocabulary, numbers of speakers per language, damage caused by earthquakes, deaths in war, deaths from terrorist incidents. Sizes of planets, sizes of companies, stock ownership, height between species, consider elephants and mice, financial markets, but your investment manager does not know it, commodity prices. Inflation rates, economic data. The extremistan list is much longer than the prior one. The tyranny of the accident. Another way to rephrase the general distinction is as follows. Mediocristan is where we must endure the tyranny of the collective, the routine, the obvious, and the predicted. Extremistan is where we are subjected to the tyranny of the singular, the accidental, the unseen, and the unpredicted. As hard as you try, you will never lose a lot of weight in a single day. You need the collective effect of many days, weeks, even months. Likewise, if you work as a dentist, you will never get rich in a single day. but you can do very well over 30 years of motivated, diligent, disciplined, and regular attendance to teeth drilling sessions. If you are subject to extremistan-based speculation, however, you can gain or lose your fortune in a single minute. Table 1 summarizes the differences between the two dynamics, to which I will refer in the rest of the book. Confusing the left column with the right one can lead to dire, or extremely lucky, consequences. This framework, showing that extremistan is where most of the black swan action is only a rough approximation. Please do not platonify it. Don't simplify it beyond what's necessary. Extremistan does not always imply black swans. Some events can be rare and consequential, but somewhat predictable, particularly to those who are prepared for them and have the tools to understand them, instead of listening to statisticians, economists, and charlatans of the bell curve variety. They are near black swans. They are somewhat tractable scientifically. Knowing about their incidence should lower your surprise. These events are rare but expected. I call this special case of gray swans Mandelbrottian randomness. This category encompasses the randomness that produces phenomena commonly known by terms such as scalable, scale invariant, power laws, Pareto-Ziff laws, Yule's law, Paretian stable processes, Levy stable, and fractal laws, and we will leave them aside for now since they will be covered in some depth in Part 3. They are scalable, according to the logic of this chapter, but you can know a little more about how they scale since they share much with the laws of nature. You can still experience severe black swans in mediocristan, though not easily. How? You may forget that something is random, think that it is deterministic, then have a surprise. Or you can tunnel and miss on a source of uncertainty, whether mild or wild, owing to lack of imagination. Most black swans result from this tunneling disease, which I will discuss in Chapter 9**. This has been a literary overview of the central distinction of this book, offering a trick to distinguish between what can belong in mediocristan and what belongs in extremistan. I said that I will get into a more thorough examination in Part 3. So let us focus on epistemology for now and see how the distinction affects our knowledge. 1001 Days, or How Not to Be a Sucker Surprise. Surprise. Sophisticated methods for learning from the future. Sextus was always ahead. The main idea is not to be a sucker. Let us move to mediocristan. If we can find it, which brings us to the black swan problem in its original form. Imagine someone of authority and rank, operating in a place where rank matters, say, a government agency or a large corporation. He could be a verbose political commentator on Fox News stuck in front of you at the health club, impossible to avoid looking at the screen. The chairman of a company discussing the bright future ahead. A Platonic medical doctor who has categorically ruled out the utility of mother's milk, because he did not see anything special in it. Or a Harvard Business School professor who does not laugh at your jokes. He takes what he knows a little too seriously. Say that a prankster surprises him one day by surreptitiously sliding a thin feather up his nose during a moment of relaxation. How would his dignified pompousness fare after the surprise? Contrast his authoritative demeanor with the shock of being hit by something totally unexpected that he does not understand. For a brief moment, before he regains his bearings, you will see disarray in his face. I confess having developed an incorrigible taste for this kind of prank during my first sleepaway summer camp. Introduced into the nostril of a sleeping camper, a feather would induce sudden panic. I spent part of my childhood practicing variations on the prank. In place of a thin feather, you can roll the corner of a tissue to make it long and narrow. I got some practice, and my younger brother, An equally effective prank would be to drop an ice cube down someone's collar when he expects it least, say during an official dinner. I had to stop these pranks as I got deeper into adulthood. Of course, but I am often involuntarily hit with such an image when bored out of my wits in meetings with serious-looking businesspersons, dark suits and standardized minds, theorizing, explaining things, or talking about random events with plenty of because in their conversation. I zoom in on one of them and imagine the ice cube sliding down his back. It would be less fashionable, though certainly more spectacular, if you put a living mouse there, particularly if the person is ticklish and is wearing a tie, which would block the rodent's normal route of exit. Asterisk. Pranks can be compassionate. I remember in my early trading days, at age 25 or so, when money was starting to become easy, I would take taxis, and if the driver spoke skeletal English and looked particularly depressed, I'd give him a $100 bill as a tip, just to give him a little jolt and get a kick out of his surprise. I'd watch him unfold the bill and look at it with some degree of consternation. $1 million certainly would have been better, but it was not within my means. It was also a simple hedonic experiment. It felt elevating to make someone's day with the trifle of $100. I eventually stopped. We all become stingy and calculating when our wealth grows and we start taking money seriously. I don't need much help from fate to get larger-scale entertainment. Reality provides such forced revisions of beliefs at quite a high frequency. Many are quite spectacular. In fact, the entire knowledge-seeking enterprise is based on taking conventional wisdom and accepted scientific beliefs and shattering them into pieces with new counterintuitive evidence. Whether at a micro scale, every scientific discovery is an attempt to produce a micro black swan, or at a larger one, as with Poincaré's and Einstein's relativity. Scientists may be in the business of laughing at their predecessors, but owing to an array of human mental dispositions, few realize that someone will laugh at their beliefs in the disappointingly near future. In this case, my readers and I are laughing at the present state of social knowledge. These big guns do not see the inevitable overhaul of their work coming, which means that you can usually count on them to be in for a surprise. How to learn from the turkey. The Uber philosopher Bertrand Russell presents a particularly toxic variant of my surprise jolt in his illustration of what people in his line of business call the problem of induction or problem of inductive knowledge, capitalized for its seriousness. Certainly the mother of all problems in life. How can we logically go from specific instances to reach general conclusions? How do we know what we know? How do we know that what we have observed from given objects and events suffices to enable us to figure out their other properties? There are traps built into any kind of knowledge gained from observation. Consider a turkey that is fed every day. Every single feeding will firm up the bird's belief that it is the general rule of life to be fed every day by friendly members of the human race, looking out for its best interests. As a politician would say, on the afternoon of the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, something unexpected will happen to the turkey. It will incur a revision of belief. Asterisk. The rest of this chapter will outline the black swan problem in its original form. How can we know the future, given knowledge of the past, or, more generally, how can we figure out properties of the infinite, unknown based on the finite known? Think of the feeding again. What can a turkey learn about what is in store for it tomorrow from the events of yesterday? A lot, perhaps, but certainly a little less than it thinks. And it is just that little less that may make all the difference. The turkey problem can be generalized to any situation where the same hand that feeds you can be the one that wrings your neck. Consider the case of the increasingly integrated German Jews in the 1930s, or my description in Chapter 1 of how the population of Lebanon got lulled into a false sense of security by the appearance of mutual friendliness and tolerance.